All right, so this is the last of the three of our little videos for this week, for this first week. And we're going to look at development in terms of lifespan theories. So one way of characterizing lifespan development is that it is multidirectional. Each age has gains and losses, that it is open to change and influence. One of the ways we can talk about this is calling it plastic or plasticity. Um, it is embedded within the historical context in which it occurs. Lifespan depends on context, so not just historical context, but context in terms of cultural location in the world. And then it is best studied with multiple disciplines. So multi-directional, one of the best ways for thinking about this is these models based on Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems. And this is referred to in some of the readings for this week. But thinking about not only how individuals are encapsulated in larger systems, but also how each influences each other. So focusing on the multi-directional influences. The other thing to consider is that we're not all on the same path, right? So while there are universal milestones in development across individuals, the cultural and historical location that we find ourselves in may influence what that development looks like a lot. Okay, so each stage has gains and losses. There are things that we can benefit from that are great, that are gains at every point in life. There are also losses. So there's historically, we had thought about children as gaining abilities or gaining qualities to their life, and then older folks as losing things. But it is a more complete and complex description to think about both gains and losses at each point throughout life. Development is also subject to change or influence. So what 40 looks like for me as a 40-year-old may be very different than what 40 looks like for somebody else. I have an aunt who had a major stroke by the time she was 40. So 40 for her looked really different physiologically, cognitively, etc. My sister is turning 40 in a couple of years, and she has 3 kids and a full-time job and owns a house. I don't have a house, I don't have kids. The 40 looks really different for her as well, right? So what 40 looks like, or what any given age or stage looks like, may be really different depending on the context in which it occurs. Also, considering the historical time in which it occurs. And this is, again, some to get you started thinking about that final paper where you're doing an interview of somebody of a different cohort or a different kind of birth group than your own. There are lots of major life things that people have lived through that will influence how they live on for the rest of their lives. You may be familiar with some of these pictures, maybe not with others of these pictures, but the traumas, concerns, trends even that are common in your age may influence you. Also dependent on context, these folks are all roughly the same age, and they're from pictures from the internet, and in different parts of the world. So considering what it is that late 60s looks like, excuse me, in different parts of the world. And then lastly, like a lot of things, because there's so much going on to consider here for lifespan development, it is best studied through lots of different disciplines. So a focus here for looking at lifespan development is to consider the way, what is stable across time and what has changed. We're not going to do this activity, but looking at adult development, you can see that there are some things that are consistent across time, and there are some things that are changeable. We also have normative or typical developmental milestones. So when folks retire, there's some normative ages for retiring. There's normative ages for graduating from college. And then we have non-normative or atypical timing. And this is when folks, it is not normative to start a successful business in your 20s. It is also not normative to be a first-time parent after age 60. This is a non-normative aged graduating with her master's. So, and the reason I should say that I bring this up, normative and non-normative, is that things, when they are normative, even difficult transitions may be easier because they are expected. We have social and cultural kinds of meaning and support around normative changes. Non-normative changes may be more difficult. So normative or age-graded change, we can talk about your biological clock, how what your physical body is prepared for and is ready for. Also the social clock, so what your society thinks. And again, that social clock, there may be variations across different cultures. We also need to look at things that are historically normative historical influences. So what some aspects of credit, most people have multiple credit cards these days. Having credit and having debt is common, at least in the United States at this point in history. It didn't used to always be common. There's a really great graphic novel that I would recommend to you called Maus by Art Spiegelman. If you haven't seen that, you should check it out. But he talks about the impact of living through World War II in the concentration camps on his father. And it wasn't just trauma of seeing people die, but the way that you must finish all the food on your plate all the time. Because you don't know when you're going to get your next meal, right? And there are norms about living that would influence. And that was true for that generation, those folks who had that experience, but not necessarily for others, right? Also, it may be different for different cultures, even who shared a historical moment. So it's not just about history, though most folks in the world would know about who lived through World War II, knew of World War II. They weren't all necessarily impacted in the same way. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show here, and there are more cohorts here than I have on this screen, and there's lots of different ways of talking about cohorts, so I don't want to say that this is the only way of breaking down birth cohort out there. There are lots of, you can Google it and find many other descriptions. Millennials and Zennials and Generation Y and Generation Z and many other characterizations, right? But the idea is, if you look at these age groups, the folks in these age groups are likely to have experienced certain things at about the same age. So at about the same age, folks who were in the Gen X cohort, which I fit in, we remember the Challenger explosion. Some of those in that cohort were much older than I am. I was when the Challenger explosion happened, but we remember seeing the space shuttle blow up. It was traumatic. It was scary, right? We remember AIDS. We remember what that felt like when everyone was afraid to touch folks, and there's all the stigma, right? That there was that is a thing that is a no, we still have some of these issues, but they aren't felt in the same way as they were in that cohort, right? So this is kind of, again, setting the stage for that lifespan interview paper, that you need to choose somebody to interview who's from a different cohort. And then we'll be thinking about not only their developmental stage that they are at when they do the interview with you, but also what were these major things in their lives that occurred, and where were they in development at that point in their lives, which might have influenced how old they, or how they interpreted that particular event. All right, so we're going to stop there, and I will see you on the discussion board for the week.